Welcome everyone to our webinar today, the ins and outs of creating data contracts for data products. A data product implies a commitment to deliver a data asset with specific characteristics at a certain time through a specific channel with agreed upon level of quality and consistency, among other things. But how can a data provider guarantee its claims? How can a data consumer check whether the provider has delivered the data asset as promised? Well, welcome to the age of data contracts. And we are fortunate today to have three experts with us who will discuss the ins and outs of data contracts for data products, why you need them, how you construct them, and how you deploy them. So with that, I'd like to have each of our panelists introduce themselves briefly to give the audience a sense of who you are and what perspective you're coming from. And before you do, I just want to encourage the audience, if you have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat and we'll try to bring you into the conversation. So Elliot, you're the veteran of the GAM session here with me. So why don't you go first?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Elliot Cordo here. I've, been working on enterprise and data transformation problems for almost 3 decades. Specifically, for the past decade, I've been focused on cloud native adoption and build, the maturation of kind of data analytics profession overall, mostly by the fact that I've, got a background in software engineering as well. So always wondering can't we do just a little better? Why can't we be a little more like the software engineering folks? Professionally, I run a boutique consulting firm in the New York metro area, which focuses on data modernization problems.
Thanks, Elliot. Cans, up next.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I am Michael Canzaneri. Michael, and Mike, or Cans, they all work with me. I am ex-Gartner. I was an advisor, not a researcher, which means I was kind of the midway point between the customer and the research, where I helped start their big data advisory team. I also wrote their first cloud pricing model. And I am a 3-time unicorn veteran with DataStax, which is the Apache Cassandra company, Confluent, which is the Apache Kafka company, and Dataiku, which is a French-based AI company. I am currently the co-founder of an open source project called Data Squirrel, SQRL. And happy to be here. And there you go.
Glad to have you, Mike Cans. And last but not least, Matt.
Awesome. Thanks, Wayne. Matt Arellano, maybe new to even you, Wayne, but I help to lead the global data and AI team at Genpact, serial entrepreneur. My firm was most recently acquired by Genpact on June 5th of 2023. Before that, I led the global data analytics and AI strategy team at Accenture for 4.5 years. Before that, was a partner in a firm that Accenture acquired in 2018. Really always at the intersection of data, the application of artificial intelligence, and some of the newer patterns here. So whether it's mesh, contracts, any of the other terms and names we want to bring up, but really passionate about, some of the things that Elliot and Mike mentioned, really helping to instantiate better patterns, practices, and approaches within the data pipeline process. So look forward to being here in the conversation.
Terrific. Well, as you can see, we have a very illustrious, experienced, knowledgeable panel. And I should probably introduce myself, Wayne Eckerson. I was president of Eckerson Group, which is a research and strategic consulting firm until March, when I sold it to DataLear, which is a full service data architecture and engineering firm that now does strategy and governance and all those soft consulting skills that we used to do. So again, audience, if you're out there listening to us, if you have a question or comment, please put it in the chat and we'll bring you into the conversation. So with that, we'd like to start our panel discussion. I want to start by picking on Elliot. Maybe you could set the stage for us, Elliot, and talk about what's driving the interest in data contracts today. Why are we talking about this now?
Yeah, so I think data contracts are having a bit of a moment, and I really see it as there being 3 main drivers for the discussion. One, I think, is a really practical one, and one like kind of deeply rooted in kind of our data practitioner history, which is the fact that like data platforms, data warehouses, data products are constantly being broken because things that we rely on change, right? And on the contrary, the things that we build end up becoming like tightly coupled with upstream applications, and therefore crushing us with the burden of never being able to turn anything off, right? Or not having like a good answer for how like we migrate folks from system A to system B. So, this is a very traditional problem, one we've been like beating our heads up against the wall for probably as long as I've been doing it, right? Or decades, right? Um, and while this is all going on, I think that, there's been a lot of positive movement, right, in terms of the modernization of data practices and skills and patterns that we apply to like building things, right? There's this data ops movement, right? People are starting to think about building, data products as more software engineering lens than kind of this traditional old school lens of get a good data set, put in a table, and then keep your fingers crossed that you can like sustain building it, right? Like people are really thinking about like, how am I going to deploy the infrastructure with IAC? How is it going to be rigorously tested? Adopting modern SDLCs, and really taking cues from what's going on and has been going on in the software engineering world for a very long time, right? So we're getting solid progress there, and people are looking at the software engineering world and saying like, hey, what are the patterns that we can borrow from, or what rhymes with what we're doing, right? So that's driving interest in data contracts. And then I think like the thing that is related to this, I'll just spill right into it, is this concept of data mesh, or at least like federated data product responsibility, which is resonating with a great number of companies, right? And as we know, data mesh is largely influenced by microservice architecture and microservice design, which is a design pattern which is well proven, right? Despite some articles that have been out there about like going back to monoliths, like people are building microservice architectures, and it makes a whole lot of sense for many companies and many use cases. And they use APIs, and they use event registries, and they have contracts, right? They contract with each other in this federated environment, right? So allowing one thing to change without breaking another, having proper expectations as a consumer of what's coming from a producer. And really, like, now that we're thinking about applying this principle of different teams building different things, like composing a system through the work of multiple teams working on different parts of it, data needs to get a lot smarter, right, in terms of how they interface with each other. So data products is being dragged into the limelight, right? And people are really trying to solve this problem if they're going to enable this kind of federated organizational responsibility for development.
So to summarize, because that was a lot, but I think you're dead on. You said, I think there's three drivers there. One is the pain points that people are experiencing is things keep breaking because of dependencies that we have upstream and downstream, right?
Yeah.
And also we're seeing that in the software world, DevOps is now leading to data ops. So we think there's a better way to do things. And then finally, data mesh and microservices is kind of pulling us in this direction because of the way those things are architected.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Any of you guys have any comments on all those points? Want to elaborate?
I think for me, Ellie, you're spot on, right? The two reasons that, I think most of our clients and just the practitioners that we talk to are starting to walk down the path of this concept and approach is repeatability and predictability, right? You talked about it in the software engineering space, right? We're more repeatable in the patterns and the approaches. In the data space, because much of it is left to, the devices of the engineers, there is not much predictability. And then on top of that, just chain of custody, right? How the custody of from the initial producer to the engineering creation to the consumer and expecting something predictable for driving business outcomes. Now we need a design pattern that instantiates that around specific items, right? If you think about data products, for me, products have features, whether it's a sneaker, right, with soles, shoelaces, laces. In the data space, it becomes primarily metadata, right? So if we can track that and manage it, and, Elliot, to your point, we've ops around it, right? We find telemetry. Now we have a higher level of expectation, a greater set of ownership, and an ability to track. And all of those things drive greater customer satisfaction. At the end of the day, why are we doing this, right? People can use our data in a very predictable pattern to drive business outcomes, right? And that's, I think, what it comes down to. So for me, it's very much so the predictability and the repeatability that I think is driving the concept of contracts.
I think that's great, but it also suggests that we haven't been very predictable or repeatable in the past. So it's kind of an indictment of the last 20, 30 years of data development, right? But we're doing
Guilty. Yeah.
Cans, do you have anything to elaborate on that? Or
I want to just build off of something Matt said. Whenever I talk about data products, I'm old enough to remember when the first Air Jordans came out. And I think of data products like a product like that. And, since then, I can't even tell you how many versions of Air Jordans there have been, but they're a predictable way to produce them. So whenever I talk about data products, I liken it to a manufacturing process in that it has standards and it's predictable. It has, a lot of sequential steps at times, and it makes people really think about it from an engineering perspective, which is really the piece where data contracts come into play.
okay, so I want to remind the audience, if you're out there and you're listening, you have questions, put them in the chat. All right, so Matt, let's go on to you for the second question here. So what is the state of the market for data contracts right now? How pervasive are they? Are we just starting out, or are we nearing maturity in this market? What do you think?
So I think it's nascent, right? I think we're still trying to figure out the evolution. We're data people, so we need to build new concepts and terminology, right? So it was mesh. A first principle of mesh was products. And now we have products. I still think people, Ellie, you talked about like the federated approach. So what does that mean around platform, right? Is platform singular or federated? Like, should we have all the clouds? Should we have singular cloud? That's one question. Second is, how do we drive ownership? So how does the human participate in this, right? And that's a second piece of this, which I think we're still trying to figure out. Who owns definitions? How do we intake new products? How do we manage that demand? And now I think we're introducing contracts, right? I think any strong data modernization program has all of those pieces and parts with equal level of influence, which is critical, but I think it's based on variability of maturity. I think it's hard, right? So I think we're very much so at the early stages. For me, when I think about the contract, I've become a little bit of a minimalist, right? Like, let's start with the minimum set of features. Mike, you said it, right? Like let's think about it as a sneaker, right? Like, we would never release a biologic, like a pharmaceutical, right, without understanding that manufacturing process, right? It's not like you stand up a new facility every time you have a new pill that hits the market. It's very defined. We know what the facility looks like, the manufacturing process, the steps in manufacturing. Data, we don't do that, right? So I think take a minimalist approach to contracts, define what that is, get your engineers on board. Now with AI, we could, infuse more like agent in the pipeline, which I think is really important and critical. But now we're like flying spaceships compared to your question, Wayne. So I think it's early stages. For me, how to make this real is like, pick what's most important to your organization, less than 10 things that you can manage as contract, right? And where it needs to be managed between producer, like engineer and consumer. That's the easiest way to start. But I think people are just swimming in the number of terms. I think it's really hard to figure out where to focus. And contract ends up getting relegated. It's like, it's just an engineering problem. Just get the engineers to figure it out. And you get a lot of difference of opinions there. And then it can never actually be enacted in practice.
Want more Insight Jam? Subscribe to our YouTube channel for shorts, panels, podcasts, and more. In your shorts feed, enjoy a daily dose of best practices from tech experts and leading solution providers, while long-form panel discussions and keynotes, recorded live every quarter, go deep on important industry topics. And don't miss our collection of regular podcasts, keeping you informed on the latest trends. We're hard at work collecting the best enterprise technology information from around the globe. So subscribe to be notified of our next upload. Now, let's get back to the show.
Just one thing that you said made me think, do you guys think that every data asset should be turned into a product, or are there certain things that should be productized and certain things that shouldn't?
For me, no, definitely not. So
Yeah,
Mike.
I agree with that. I think you can almost look at it through the lens of master data and how you think about your most important data. Not that it has to follow the same processes. Matter of fact, it probably shouldn't, but that's the way I kind of think of it. You identify the things that really matter to your organization and then focus on that. And if you're lucky, as you make those investments up front in creating data products and data contracts, it will spill over and into your other data efforts.
I agree with that as well. I kind of think of almost like a maturation cycle to data assets, right? Like some things are experimental, maybe team or group specific, right? Not really meant for reusability or certainly not like the ground truth of an organization, right? So I think, it's okay for those things to have like a limited governance, right? And controls, and probably don't need data contracts, right? But as they start becoming of organizational importance, like figuring out how there's like a graduation process that they could be onboarded and start assuming some of those characteristics. But like I agree, I think not everything for sure.
So an ad hoc insight generated by a data analyst, that would just remain an asset. But if you're publishing a dashboard to external client or customer, I would think you would want to productize that, right? And have a contract around that. I mean, that's a pretty simple bifurcation, right? And there's a lot of gray area in between them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the defining what the difference is really important, right? What is asset versus what is product? Because then you can figure out ownership and control, right? And I don't mean like big G control, but like what are the features of an asset? Because you still want some level of certification of asset, right? And this is where I think the evolution of like catalogs and marketplace has started to drive towards. Like, and I say this to my clients, if you start down the path of data products and you stand up a data marketplace and you've only built 2 products, well, the worst data marketplace is one that only has 2 products to search, right? So you need like an asset base for people to go in and understand, like whether it's tables or some of that minimally certified stuff, right? What could they search and use upon? As you have more scale in products, now you could decide, well, maybe you want to limit the amount of assets that we showcase, but there's a balance there because it comes down to consumer experience. So I think for me, it's defining what those are organizationally, what needs to be done for an asset to be served in a way that people can understand it versus a product. And then the whole operating model behind them becomes, I think, much more visible to people and how we deliver it across an enterprise.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense, and the empty marketplace definitely resonates, right? I think it's really about setting expectations, like what's safe to use, where can I build something on top of this as a strong foundation versus I know this is experimentation, but I'm going to explore it and use it anyway.
It's interesting you mentioned the marketplace, because I do believe that once you have a data marketplace, even with 2 products, it puts you in the data product mindset. And it defines producers and consumers, and that, naturally requires some kind of interface and contract, whether it's implied or actually real, which we'll talk about in a second. We want to talk about exactly what is a data contract. But we got a couple questions that have come in. So let's address these. One is, where do you set the boundary for what is needed for a contract? And then parentheses, lineage, access controls, methods of consumption. So I think the question is, if I understand it, what is the baseline metadata that you require for a contract? In fact, maybe Mike, you can start to address that, because that is the next question to you, is what is a data contract?
Yeah. So data contract really is, it's not the typical, what has been in the past, like an SLA handshake agreement, right? It's a programmatic it's a programmatic way to enforce certain characteristics around your data. And I think, to me, a lot of it comes down to uh, the rules you want to enforce, versioning, deprecation, performance. See, Kate has a question about event streams, which I've spent a lot of time implementing, lineage and transparency. And from there, I think it really comes down to uh, to the the criticality of the data. So I've worked in various different industries, and if you miss, one event, is it really going to, rock the world? Probably not in a lot of sense. So I think you really have to look at it from a criticality or severity perspective. If you're clearing a check, then yeah, you're going to want to have stricter controls around it. So to the question there, it's really an engineering based approach to ensuring that I'm producing a product in a consistent way.
Yeah, so maybe you could also address Kate's question a little bit more. She's talking about validate the trade-off between validating, the product via
Yeah.
contract and performance, especially in a streaming environment. And you've got millions
Yeah,
of events.
And I've done hundreds of implementations specifically with Apache Kafka. So I think that comes down to your performance requirements, because a lot of times people say, well, I need real-time performance. And what they mean is sub-minute, not sub-second. So it really comes down to the balance between that performance and the validation. So if you can live with a little bit degraded performance, but always have the right consistency and the right adherence to the contract, then you could kind of play with that real-time definition a little bit. If it's no, I need the performance now, then you're going to have to essentially wait for an after-the-fact sampling, I think, around some of this. And again, I've seen everything from IoT sensors to clearing checks and credit card payments. So I think that's the balance you play. It's the performance need versus the need for validation. That balance right there.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think you talk about Kafka and just like little tiny tangent. I think that event-based architecture and the way that we, when done right, the usage of schema registries and kind of like the interaction of event-based applications is very akin to data products, right? But anyway, getting back to like Kate's thing, and maybe one comment you made, one thing that I'd maybe argue is perhaps important for data products, right, in terms of overall like metadata and usability, but probably not part of the contract, is maybe lineage, right? Because the purpose of the contract is that you don't care how the sausage gets made, right? You only care that the expectation is met. Does that make sense?
Yeah, lineage is one of my sub areas in my contract definition, and it's very often overlooked. But when I talk about the impact of data contracts, I really talk about three impacts: the technical impact, the financial impact, and the people impact. And the people impact really comes down to the trust.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, when you talk about the data quality or the data in their organization, the initial reaction is, well, it's not great, the quality stinks. And you're like, why? Well, I don't know how or where it comes from and how it's merged and transformed. So lineage often becomes a part of the conversation. And a lot of times it's more of I want to make sure it's coming from this source at all times or these sources at all times. So wonderful call out and spot on with that.
I think it actually introduces an important debate, right? In this concept of contracts, is like, who has primacy in thinking about what's in a contract? Is it the producer or the consumer? Because what was just mentioned is like, does lineage matter? And Elliot, I agree with what you said, right? Like, is it important to manage it in contract? Maybe not, right? But is it important for a consumer to understand, right? Mike, to your point, So
Yeah.
introducing a marketplace concept, like the first thing anyone ever asks is, where does it come from? Right. Then we get into the debate of like level of lineage, right? Is it, table level, right? Row level down to code, and code's always the hardest part. I think that's a important piece of the concept of contract creation, initial, and then evolution, right? Because you might want to evolve your contract to manage more pieces of metadata. I think what becomes important for consumers, like who owns it, some of the schema details, right? Maybe that leads down to lineage, definitions, right? Can definitions change? Who's responsible for it? And then some of the telemetry details. But I think it introduces an important concept of, when we think about contract, do we skew left to producer? Do we skew right for consumer? Do we take both sides, and how that actually physically manifests up into a marketplace and down into code?
Yeah, I think well said. I think maybe what we're saying, like what we're thinking is, we're talking about data contracts today. Maybe this is a whole other session. Is it's maybe more than data contracts, right? To have a healthy data product infrastructure and marketplace, right? But I listen. I think lineage is super important, and the lucky thing is, after years and years of grappling with like how we do it, right? It's starting to become feasible, right, across both streaming and batch modalities, which is like super exciting time to be building stuff, right?
Does a data contract differ if your product's in a marketplace versus like the streaming environment that we just gave? Because like in a marketplace, a couple of years ago, there was just files, right? And now sometimes you can turn those into real-time queries to pull out your data and deliver it. But is there a difference between the two? If it's or can you create the same contract and apply it no matter where it's based?
It's a good question. I guess like my hot take, and I'd love for everybody to chime in, is that like I think they're functionally more or less equivalent, in terms of like their purpose and like and what they deliver and what expectations they provide. I think, in terms of, if we're talking about the unification of like a batch and streaming modality in terms of like contracts, I think that's not quite fleshed out. I think there's two kind of like separate worlds that you can marry together, and potentially use different technologies to provide the functionality, but I don't think there's a unification just yet.
Michael, can you do us a favor though, especially for non-technical folks in the audience, like me? I mean, how do you write a data contract? Right? It's YAML, right? And I mean, how does this get done? There's the nuts and bolts of actually putting one together.
Yeah, you could do it in a number of different ways. YAML's one, but it's programmatic. We have in our software, we have multiple ways that we handle it. Lineage is a big one, because you want to see all the way back to the original source. A lot of it is also based on how the underlying infrastructure and software, because you want to understand the performance of it because of SLA, specifically. So it's a combination of a few factors, and because it's still nascent in many respects, I think what you'll find is a lot of different ways to approach it in no unified way, because you're going to have certain data contracts that are based on bare metal infrastructure that can perform much faster than cloud infrastructure. So your SLAs might be different, although in cloud you can also mimic a bare metal type environment. So I think the combinations of different ways that you could serve the data is going to make it a little bit programmatically hard at first. So you'll see a hodgepodge of a stitchwork coming together. We serve it up through an easy interface, but it took us a little while to do that because of the many different sources that we use to deliver data, both batch and streaming, and on-prem and cloud /hybrid. So I think you're going to see a really patchwork type approach to it in the next few years. So not as technical as you want, but that's what's going to happen. Mark my words.
You already gotten your crystal ball out. Okay, we're gonna do that in the end too. Figure out where things are going from here. Matt, looks like you were about to say something.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Mike said. I think for like the basic user, right? Those that are starting, like YAML's the easiest way to manage it initially, right? Kind of the physical instantiation of what the contract becomes. That's typically what we see across our clients in practice is you start with YAML. And Mike, to your point, putting a front face on that, which allows you to govern, right? Like call it contract creation initially is a very easy way to lower the threshold, right, of contract onboarding. I think it makes life a lot easier, but you have different ways of doing it. I think YAML, from what we've seen, is most widely adopted right now.
Yeah. And to be specific, and it's probably the technologies that you guys are talking about, just for the listeners, there's two main camps that are being used and this might be another question, but there's the open data contract standard by Vitol, which is, gaining some traction. And then of course, DBT is basically eating the world in terms of like data product creation. So DBT has its own contract language, which is very close to Vitol's. They're I think eventually they might converge into an open standard. But that's basically the tools for getting things done.
So let me play this out a little bit as a non-technologist. So a data producer puts together a data contract using one of these standards. So great, they've defined what they're going to do, how it's done, maybe even the lineage. Then what, right? What does the consumer do? Maybe the consumer is just a business person, perhaps. What happened? How do they know if the contract has been lived up to, right? Or if there's been a violation? What were the mechanics there?
Yeah, that's the most important part. You can have a contract, right? And it's meaningless, right? It'd be like putting, a data dictionary or a table in Confluence, right? As many companies do, right? It all comes down to testability, right? You've got to have a way through your platform, right? Through a DevOps process that you're actually validating and testing that contract, right? As part of your release process. So whereby if someone tries to release a version of the code which breaks the contract, that's actually a breaking change, right? It breaks the build. People are prohibited. And then similarly, giving capabilities on the consumer side that they can also do their own assertions against the contract, right? And coming back to event-based architecture, well-built event-based architecture has the same exact characteristics, right? Like you have a schema registry, you have a client library, you have as a producer, tests that you're actually adhering to the contract, right? And that's what makes it all work, right? The testing to me is the most important part.
So the onus is on the consumer to actually build some capabilities to validate that the contract.
More so the producer is providing the guarantee. They're basically saying, my tests passed, this contract is upheld, right?
Oh, okay. And the consumer just
And alerting.
And alerting, yeah.
And alerting that comes off it, yeah. So alerting that comes off it to Elliot's point.
So the consumer doesn't have to do anything necessarily. They just have to pay attention to any alerts that come across.
In a good world, in a perfect world, you have a dashboard that you can go to and you can see that contract's upheld and where the what's called the variances may occur and how if they're within range or outside of range in certain respects for certain data. But also as a producer, you should have an alerting mechanism that can go out and say, hey, this contract is close to being violated or is violated. And that's really important, especially when you're talking about if you're in the public sector with secret data, or if you're in healthcare with HIPAA data and so on. So I think a really good sound engineering discipline when you're creating these contracts and products will at some point become part of it so that, if, for instance, if you're in healthcare and you have HIPAA data, I can copy it to this system, but no further. And that's the contract both the producer and consumer upholds, because, as Matt was mentioning earlier, it's not only it's kind of like, I look at it almost like an SOW, right? I'm going to deliver X and you're going to pay me Y. And if you're really in line with the contract, part of that contract is you can only share it to this system and nowhere else. You can only copy it to this system and nowhere else. So there should be some sort of a learning mechanisms built into it.
So a contract can also apply to the consumer in their terms of usage. So
Absolutely.
they can only use it for 6 months, or they can only use it on this platform. Yeah. Oh, cool.
Correct.
Okay.
One small tweak on that, like I think that's super interesting. But one thing, like kind of parallel to that, is like the idea of just straight contract testing. An ideal world, the producer does a really good job, and the consumers are just smooth sailing. I do recommend in all of these architectures that there be defensive checks on the consumer side as well, right? Especially in an emerging data ops framework, when you are kind of connecting to lightly modeled and governed upstream legacy products, right? The consumers need to have their own assurances as well, for sure.
I think it's an interesting area for agents to be introduced to, right? Are there agents of which that could be utilized by consumers, kind of standard ones, to track or validate, right, in real time some of the contractual mechanisms and agreements? And then, Wayne, to your first point, I think it becomes workflow, right? If a contract is broken, how do we get, it's chain of custody again. How do we get something out to the consumers to say there's a problem, right? And then it can be on the consumer to make the decision if they want to utilize that output, right? Or if it's something based on the SLA, when it's going to be fixed. I mean, if it's regulatory reporting and we know that the contract has been broken, we probably don't want to submit that data, right? We want to wait until it's fixed. So those are the ways of which it's almost like the workflow process and data governance, right? We got to kick off. And back to Mike, your point, like the SOW, like what happens when an assumption's blown in an SOW? Like a note goes out to someone, and we got to have a meeting. So not to say that we need the meeting, but like I need to be alerted that there's something wrong with what you committed to giving me. And the implication of that could be to stop. It could be to be cautious, right? It could be just go forth, but just realize, there might be some problems, but in 24 hours, it can be fixed.
We have another question that's come in. Given PII, PHI as examples, how do you control or manage, quote unquote, you can only copy this data to the system? Yeah, so I think they're like saying, how can you control the usage or the deployment of PII data?
Yeah, I think again, programmatically, you can set access controls on a system by system basis. So if you have a data product, you can define which systems it can be copied, the data can be copied to. And a perfect example of that is retail point of sale or POS data. In multiple retail customers I've worked with, the standard was you've taken POS data and it ends up being copied everywhere. And I give an example in one of my presentations where it gets copied 11 different times, right? Well, in this data contract world, what you could say is, and you can even get down to the columnar level, say, this system can have all the data, this system can have these 5 columns out of the 10, and this system can have none of the data. So it could be enforced at the contract level programmatically. That's how I think of it, but that's more perfect world, I think. But at least, it's a step forward from where a lot of the retailers are today. And it's important because you see retailers get in trouble all the time for data leakage.
Yeah.
So it's something that's very top of mind, especially with some of the retailers I'm working with and how they're rethinking their data infrastructure for the future.
And that's one of the benefits of some commercial marketplaces, is that you can set access controls there as well. And sometimes they don't even let you move it out of the marketplace itself. Usually that's when you're trying to validate or evaluate the product to see if you actually want to buy it or subscribe to it.
What we've seen in that space, I think, is a critical like inflection point of like the consumerism part. So you might have a data product that has PHI or PII that isn't masked, right, or obfuscated at all. And that product is utilized by a smaller subset of people. Could be searched in the marketplace, right? But when somebody goes to retrieve it, I can't see that because of my restrictions in group. Like in pharma, real world data is a great one. Like real world data should never be seen by like outside of like 5 people that are using it in commercial or maybe development. But there's also then you could have a masked product, right? Where maybe some of the PHI or PII elements are masked. The other area we're starting to see the rise of, you see this in like training sets for language models, but also on the consumer side of data product access is synthetic data products, right? So can I create a product of which that has PHI or PII, but it's just not our population, right? Our patient population or people. That's another area that I think you start to see the connection between producers, consumers, and like customer experience. And that allows you to kind of think about how people would want to consume, but maybe not with exposing any level of risk to an organization.
Yeah, I think all that's been said makes sense. I think one thing I'll come back to is data contracts alone do not make a healthy data product platform and delivery platform and marketplace for sure. And I not to repeat any that said, I'd say the one thing that I also think there's like a lot of opportunity here is in autonomous agents that are enforcing data governance policies within an organization, right? This is all emerging, and we are finding good success in early experimentation and implementation. But I think that's going to be part of it. And if we return to the good old data mesh book, one of the most abstract things she talks about is the programmatic governance, right? Or the autonomous governance, right? And I think at scale, you do have to have mechanisms like that to, prevent the pervasive, use of PII and PHI, right? There's not enough humans to keep eyeballs on it. And, the assignment of RBAC policies and other things that are part of the components of the solution are not enough. We're going to have to figure out how to do this more programmatically and more autonomously.
Yeah, and I think you were talking about all of these processes and access controls and everything, and it sounds like data bureaucracy in many respects.
Yeah.
But in reality, if you have good engineering discipline and you make the upfront investment in how to do it, it pays dividends down the road. So you won't feel that burden, is what I'm getting to, after those things are in place.
Yep.
It won't be like this, oh, I have to adhere to all these data contracts. No, it won't be like that theoretically.
No.
If you do it well, it should be innocuous to you. You should not see it unless there's a problem. Then you get alerted to it.
Yeah. I agree. I think like platform investment is really what makes this all easy, right? You build once, you use many, right? You build the scaffolding. You basically have the template for everything that you build with the proper controls, right? And it's all seamless versus a bunch of people building the same things, maybe not building them to the same degree of quality and maturity and interoperability, right? So platform investment is the key, especially, narrowly towards data contracts and their usage.
So Elliot, you don't like artisanal data development? You really want to industrialize data development? Make us like software?
And then I want to put it on a t-shirt. It sounds cool. And I haven't had lunch yet, so artisanal is making me think of like food in some weird way. But no, I think the only way you can really handle like a productive, safe, federated environment is by doing the platform work, the scaffolding. The scaffolding is a secret sauce, right? The investing in a data ops framework is the secret sauce.
Well, that is the bugaboo of data mesh, right? When business people or data leaders hear about it, it's like, oh, you've got this silo over here. Now we're legitimized, right? We can just keep doing what we're doing. They don't realize that you actually need a really strong center. And I think today we're talking about a strong data platform and data engineering principles and disciplines that get done centrally, and those standards are set, and then whatever you build gets built on that, and you can then build out on the edges, right? And everything still fits, holds together.
I think on that point, Wayne, what you mentioned, because we see it all the time, right? Elliot, you introduced like the operating model concept in that, right? So I agree with the scaffolding. I think the points of abrasion that you see in an organization are, does that mean the center needs to build everything, right? And then the spokes can consume? Well, I think we're seeing in the more progressive organizations is like the in-source pattern, where the center will build things, right, that the spokes consume, but that doesn't mean the spokes can't commit back, right? In like an open source format, where they might build some contractual mechanism that then the center hardens, right? The data teams, the center CDO teams, or whoever that might be. But that level of flexibility and variability, I think, is scary for most companies, because the center team wants to command and control. That drives down like unit costs, and the spokes want autonomy. So you have to have some tolerance there. And I think as you think about contracts, golden paths, that scaffolding as to how we build it, you do need to allow like the spokes, that federated structure, to be able to commit back as well. That's a really strong operating model. And I think it allows for just openness, right? Higher satisfaction across all pieces.
Yeah, you read my mind on my very next comment. So perfect. Well said.
Unlock better leads through Solutions Review events.
Welcome to Data Demo Day. Expert Roundtable, Solution Spotlight featuring Monte Carlo, Cohesity, Denodo, Cloudflare, High Gear, Broadcom, Next Thing.
Boost your brand with a webinar that shares comprehensive use cases, real-time product demos, and an interactive Q&A. All broadcast live to LinkedIn, YouTube, and Zoom from our Boston studio, or even on location. Fill your sales funnel with high-quality targeted leads. And contact us today by visiting solutionsreview.com/virtual events.
All right, so we're coming down to the end of our time here. I want to ask one question before we get to the speed round, which is the impact of Gen AI on all of this. How's AI going to affect data contracts, data products, data mesh even? Any thoughts? Actually, that was a question for Michael.
Yeah, I think it still maintains the consistency, whether it's from a batch environment, an event streaming environment, or synthetic data. The idea is similar. I just think the idea of you're not guaranteeing trust is probably the interesting part. You're guaranteeing structure, timeliness, governance, and all the other things we've mentioned, but there's just an inherited understanding that this is just created out of some neural network that is generating data that you want. It may not be real data, but it's definitely valuable and it'll definitely help your business. You just have to understand it's just created like anything else, is coming out of a system. But everything else still applies. I think the more interesting things are how we use Gen AI to govern the contracts.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
And how how that gets implemented. But I think you just at the very base of the question, it's a data contract is a data contract is a data contract. It might just be a different version of the data contract you're used to.
Right. Yeah. Now, Matt, you mentioned using agentic AI to help resolve issues with data contracts, or check or validate data contracts. Is that where you see it going?
For me, there's things of which, right, in that contract, I think, agents could help to build, right? That makes just coding easier. And I think, Elliot, you mentioned it, just testing and validation, right? Are there ways in which the agent can just drive that level of validation on some level of frequency? So humans don't always have to check it. That could just be in like looking at the dashboard when like flags go off, right? But it could also be in actually the test cases themselves. I think those are going to be just two ends of the spectrum, the bookends of how we're going to see agents across the data contract process.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think just maybe a restatement, but a little take on this. I think it's like two ways. I think there's um using the models to generate non-probabilistic assets related to the data contract itself, the tests, right? Which are validated and then consistent, right? They're non-probabilistic, they're code interpreted through code, right? But if we've learned anything on the software engineering side, isn't it terrific to write a whole lot less like unit test case, or write the unit test case that you were never writing, right? So I think that model applies, and then I think you know more as we just mentioned, which was using autonomous agents more probabilistically to do uh, diagnostic and kind of checking for certain data governance controls, etc. Right. So I think those things, two married together, are really a powerful way that we're going to get somewhere.
Great. All right. So last question. This is our speed round. I'm going to sneeze here in a second. So let me see if I can get this question out before that happens. So we really want you guys to get out your crystal balls and give us a sense of where you think this whole market of data products and data contracts specifically is going to be in 18 to 24 months. Who wants to go first?
Oh, you can go, Elliot.
Oh, me?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll go.
Yeah, I think like two quick things. I think I mentioned there'll be some convergence in terms of like almost like a JSON spec, open API, kind of standard, which no matter what platform you're using or what tools, it is a standard way of representing data contracts. So there can be more interoperability across like platforms, right? Versus like locking in and not having portability. Like, hey, I'm using DBT, you're not using DBT. Tough, you've got to use DBT contracts because it's different than the open source spec, right? So I think there'll be that, and then I think just in general we're going to see a little bigger than data contracts, but I think maturation of kind of like standard data ops frameworks, and there's a few out there, like including one called data ops, right? Where we're coming up with like what does the full package for data products look like, right? Inclusive of that before mentioned open data contract spec.
Yeah, I think to that, I've written about the data product framework, and I think you're going to see a lot more specialization around it. So one of the outcomes I'm even starting to see is a data product manager position that's starting to pop up in some organizations. Specifically, it's starting to pop up in financial institutions because they want to produce good data and they want to know where their data goes. So I think you're going to start to see that. And they'll follow their data ops framework. And like I said, I wrote about a data product framework, which is it's a blend of business and technical. And especially when I think you think about the value of data and how people are trying to monetize data, which is why it may lead to more of a data product manager type role coming into existence in the future.
Can you do data products without a data product manager?
Theoretically, you can't, but God knows people do it.
Well,
Yeah, I think there's a quick bite there is like I think that there is an engineering focused kind of version of what we're trying to accomplish, much like the people who own the microservices, like the technicians, that can be productive if that doesn't exist. But I think in the end, if we're thinking about it, data needs to be treated as a product and should have a dedicated role, or at least somebody assuming that role within the organization, perhaps the existing product manager who now needs to learn about data, right? But yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, how else are you going to define the product, get requirements, define the specs, work with the tech team, work with the customers, create new versions, all that stuff, right? You need a product manager. Otherwise, it just falls apart, I think. Anyway, who's next?
I think that's me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to round third on that one, I think, we talked about the tools. I think you'll see a proliferation of the ops tools, right? And more of that kind of bleeding into engineering and not just management. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that comes about. They might have an interesting opportunity to use agents to back into some of the engineering pipeline process. They're more downstream in management, but they could work upstream. That would be interesting. Mike, you mentioned the product manager is probably the number one role that we see many organizations trying to train around. And is it like, do we take the functional person and make them more technical? Do we take the technical person, make them more functional? How do we do it? And like that manager becomes a marketer too, as much as they are manager. How do you express to people why you should use my product, incentives behind it? I think the last piece that I'm hopeful we'll get to with contracts is how did this become a little bit of a certification process, like in pre-training and post-training in Gen AI too? And that's both for structured and unstructured. So if we can control, we can understand, we have proper tagging and labeling, and those are features of the products. Now we at least have some understanding of what's going into the model, what's the output, and some of that traceability. You could almost view that as like the rubber stamping, like the copywriting, right? As a model, you know, that you prompt, you might get at the output of that prompt, right? And this data product is utilized for internal data. So I think there's ways in which this becomes almost like certification for some of the training as it relates to generative processes in an enterprise.
All right, so I'd like to add a prediction here too, which is I think you'll see internal data marketplaces become much more pervasive. As organizations create data products and contracts, they need a place to put them so people can find them. And that's the biggest function of a marketplace, but also it helps corral all the metadata. It helps you define very easily in one place all the terms of usage, terms of service, subscriptions, payments, if you're going to do that. So it really kind of creates the whole environment that facilitate data products. And I would think also data contracts as well. So I think that's going to happen it's already happening. I was beating that drum 2 years ago, and I was happy to see that seems to be catching up. So anyway, with that, we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists. It was a great discussion. I learned a ton, and I think our audience did too. Also want to thank our audience for listening in, either live, thank you, and for all your great questions, or recorded. And if you have any other questions for me or any of our illustrious panelists, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can contact me at wayne@eckerson.com, and I can pass the message along, or you can find these guys on LinkedIn and contact them directly. So thank you all. Thank the panelists. Thank the audience. Have a great day.